10,000 feet above the Peruvian Amazon, the world exploded. It was Christmas Eve, 1971. Inside the chaos of Lanza Flight 508, 17-year-old Julian Köpke heard the screams, saw the Christmas presents tumbling through the cabin, and then heard her mother saying calmly, "Now it's all over." Seconds later, Julian wasn't inside the plane anymore. She was outside. As she later put it, "I hadn't left the plane had left me." She was strapped to a row of 3 seats, spinning violently toward the jungle canopy 2 miles below. The wind roared in her ears. She looked down at the dense green below, thinking it looked like broccoli. Then she blacked out. When she woke up, it was the next day, Christmas morning. She was on the jungle floor, still trapped in the seat, half buried in mud. She was alive, but out of 92 people on board, she was the only one. She had a broken collarbone that shifted with every breath, a concussion so severe she couldn't see straight, a deep gash on her arm was pulsing with pain. She was lost in the middle of the most hostile environment on Earth, wearing only a thin summer dress, missing her glasses, and with only one shoe. For the next 11 days, the Amazon would try everything to kill her. Starvation, drowning, venomous snakes, and an infection that was already starting to eat her alive. Julian was just a teenager, but she possessed a secret weapon. Knowledge taught to her by her parents. But as the days dragged on and her body began to fail, she would face a horror that would force her to pour gasoline into an open wound to stop maggots from eating her alive. Julian Köpke wasn't supposed to be on Flight 508. She wasn't even supposed to be in Lima that week. Julian was the daughter of 2 renowned German zoologists. Her father, Hans Wilhelm, was an expert on Amazonian wildlife, and her mother, Maria Köpke, was a leading ornithologist. They didn't just raise Julian in a typical city environment. When she was 14, they moved the city deep into the Amazonian jungle to establish Panguana, a remote research station. Panguana had no running water and no electricity. For Julian, this was home. While other teenagers were focused on schoolwork, Julian was being homeschooled in survival. Her parents taught her everything: how to identify poisonous snakes versus harmless ones, how to avoid the silent stingrays hiding in the mud, how to spot the dangers that most people would miss. Most importantly, her father gave her one crucial rule. If you are ever lost in the jungle, find running water and follow it downstream. Creeks become streams, streams become rivers, and rivers always lead to civilization. This wasn't just advice, it was a lifeline. By 1971, Julian had returned to Lima to finish high school. She was 17, focused on studying zoology, just like her parents. The plan was simple: finish her exams and fly back to Panguana for Christmas. But there was a complication. Her graduation ceremony and the school dance were scheduled for December 22nd and 23rd. Juliana desperately wanted to attend, and it was a milestone she didn't want to miss. Her mother, Maria, was already in Lima to collect her. They were booked to fly on December 20th. Juliana begged her mother to let her stay for the event. Maria understood it was important, so she agreed to postpone their travel until Christmas Eve, December 24th. It was a seemingly innocent decision that would lead to tragedy. When they arrived at the Lima airport on Christmas Eve, the place was a madhouse. All flights to Pucallpa, the closest airport to Panguana, were fully booked. All except one: Lanza Airlines. Lanza had a catastrophic safety record. Just the year before, a Lanza flight crashed, killing 99 out of 100 people on board. Juliana's father had explicitly warned them, please fly with anyone else. But it was Christmas Eve. They desperately wanted to be back home with Hans Wilhelm. Maria looked at the chaotic airport and made a fateful choice. She booked the 2 remaining seats on Lanza Flight 508. She told Julian, "I think it will be okay." The plane, a Lockheed L-11A Electra turboprop, took off just before noon. Juliana and her mother settled into the penultimate row, row 19. Juliana took the window seat. For the first 30 minutes, the flight was normal. The crew served sandwiches, the atmosphere was festive. But as the plane climbed toward 21,000 feet, the weather shifted dramatically. They flew directly into a massive, towering thunderstorm cell. The sky turned black. Lightning flashed violently in every direction. The turbulence was extreme, slamming the aircraft up and down with brutal force. Overhead, lockers burst open, spilling luggage and Christmas gifts into the aisle. People began to scream. Juliana gripped the armrest, terrified. She looked out of the window and saw something impossible. A gleaming white light directly on the right wing. A lightning bolt had struck the fuel tank. The wing was on fire. The plane lurched violently and nosedived. The aerodynamic forces were too much for the structure. The right wing tore off, the aircraft began to break apart midair. It was in that moment, amidst the deafening roar of the engines and the screams of 91 people, that Juliana heard her mother say with chilling calm, "Now it's all over." The next second, their row of seats was ripped from the fuselage. Juliana was in freefall. And the impact was brutal. She regained consciousness hours later. It was raining, she was still strapped into the seat, upside down. Her first thought was her mother. She managed to unbuckle herself and tried to stand, but collapsed immediately. The pain was overwhelming. She assessed her injuries. Her collarbone was visibly broken. She had a deep gash on her calf and another on her upper arm. Her left knee ligament was torn, but the most immediate problem was her vision. The sudden decompression of the plane had burst the capillaries in her eyes, turning the whites blood red. Her left eye was swollen completely shut. Worse, she was extremely nearsighted, and her glasses were gone. The jungle was a terrifying green blur. Juliana spent the rest of Christmas Eve drifting in and out of consciousness. The concussion made it impossible to think clearly. The next morning, Christmas Day, the reality of her situation hit her. She was alone. She called out for her mother, but the only response was the buzzing and screeching of the jungle. She searched the immediate area around her seat. There was little wreckage. No bodies, no sign of human life. The jungle had swallowed the plane whole. But she did find one thing. A small bag of candy spilled from someone's luggage. It wasn't food, but it was sustenance. She took it. She heard the hum of rescue planes overhead. She looked up, desperate, but the canopy was just too thick. They couldn't see her, and she couldn't signal them. The feeling of total powerlessness set in. If she was going to survive, she had to rescue herself. The jungle knowledge her parents had taught her started to surface through the concussion fog. She recognized the sounds around her. She wasn't afraid of the jungle itself, but she respected its dangers. Then she heard it. The faint sounds of dripping water. She remembered her father's rule: follow the water. She found the source, a tiny spring feeding a rivulet. This was her path. Juliana began her trek. It was agonizingly slow, with a broken collarbone and a torn knee ligament. Every step was torture. Because she only had one sandal, she had to use it to test the ground carefully before stepping with her bare foot. The forest floor was littered with thorns and perfectly camouflaged venomous snakes like the deadly fer-de-lance. And she had to navigate this minefield nearly blind, unable to distinguish a vine from a viper until she was right on top of it. She followed the water, and as her father predicted, the rivulet became a creek. She waded into it. It was safer than the jungle floor. She knew that snakes usually sunbathed on the banks, not in the water, and she knew the piranhas, despite their reputation, rarely attacked in flowing water. But the water presented its own dangers. Stingrays buried themselves in the mud. One wrong step on their barbed tail would paralyze her with pain and end her journey right there. Every step was a gamble. She shuffled slowly, probing the mud, praying she wouldn't hit one. The days began to blur together. She rationed the candy, allowing herself 1 or 2 pieces a day, and hunger was a constant and agonizing companion. She saw fruit trees but couldn't identify them clearly without her glasses, and she knew the risk of eating the wrong fruit was an agonizing death by poison, so she chose the slow agony of starvation instead. The nights were the worst. The temperature dropped and she shivered uncontrollably in her wet, thin dress. The insects were relentless. Mosquitoes and midges swarmed her, covering her body in bites, buzzing around her head, trying to crawl into her ears and nose. She barely slept. On the fourth day, she heard a sound that paralyzed her. The unmistakable, ugly flapping of king vultures. She knew what that meant. King vultures only land when there's significant carry-on, where there is death. She followed the sound, moving cautiously toward the smell. She found a row of 3 seats jammed into the earth. The impact had been so severe that the passengers, still strapped in, were buried headfirst in the ground, only their legs visible. Yulian stared in horror. The sight was gruesome, the smell overwhelming. She forced herself to check the feet of the woman in the middle. She needed to know if it was her mother. But the toenails were painted. Her mother never wore nail polish. Relief washed over her, immediately followed by profound guilt. She continued down the stream. Shaken, the bag of candy was now gone and she was now starving, surviving only on river water. Her body was weakening rapidly. Around the 6th day, she heard a different sound, the call of a hoatzin, a subtropical bird. Her mother, the ornithologist, had taught her about this bird. It nests exclusively near open stretches of water, the kind of places where people sometimes settle. Hope surged through her. Maybe she was getting closer. But the jungle wouldn't let her go that easily. The psychological toll was becoming extreme. The small cut on her upper arm sustained during the crash had been constantly wet and exposed. It was now severely infected. When she looked closely at the wound, she saw movement. Botfly larvae and maggots. Flies had laid eggs in the wound, and they had hatched. They were burrowing into her arm, eating at her flesh. She could feel them moving under her skin. The pain was excruciating, and the psychological horror was overwhelming. They were eating her alive. It was a profound violation, and she was watching her own body become food, decomposing while she was still conscious. She tried to dig them out, but they were too deep and too numerous. The infection was spreading, and she knew that if it continued, she would die of sepsis. She kept walking, the pain in her arm now matching the agony in her collarbone and knee. She started to encounter larger wildlife. Caimans, Amazonian crocodiles, slid into the water as she approached. Howler monkeys roared from the canopy. While fascinating, this was also a bad sign. Animals like this don't live closely to civilization. She knew she was still deep in the primary rainforest. By the 9th day, Yulian was collapsing frequently. She was emaciated, covered in hundreds of festering insect bites, and burning with fever from the infection. She was losing hope. She began to hallucinate, seeing lights and hearing voices that weren't there. She began to think she would die there, alone on the riverbank. On the 10th day, she was too weak to walk. She mostly floated or swam down the river, letting the current carry her. The river was widening, but there was still no sign of people. Late in the afternoon, she rounded a bend in the river and saw something unnatural. A small, motorized canoe tied to the bank, and up on the hill, a small, palm-thatched hut. It was the first sign of civilization in 10 days. She crawled out of the water, using the last of her strength to reach the hut. It was empty. Inside, she found some tools and, crucially, an outboard motor and a canister of gasoline. She looked at the gasoline, then at the writhing maggots in her arm. She remembered something else her father had taught her. Years ago, their family dog had become infested with worms in the jungle. She watched her father pour kerosene on the wound. The chemicals suffocated the parasites, forcing them to the surface where they could be removed. Gasoline was not kerosene, but it was close enough. Yulian knew this was going to hurt, but the alternative was death. She took the canister and poured the gasoline directly into the open wound on her arm. The pain was immediate and blinding. It felt like her arm was on fire. She screamed, but there was no one to hear it. Slowly, agonizingly, the maggots began to squirm out of her flesh, trying to escape the burning chemical. Julian watched, nauseated but determined. She counted them as they emerged, one by one. 35 maggots came out of her arm. She had performed field surgery on herself alone in the middle of the Amazon. Exhausted and reeling from the pain, she decided to wait in the hut for the owners to return. She wouldn't steal the boat. She knew that in the jungle, a boat was life. She tried to sleep under a tarp, but the ground was too hard on her broken collarbone. She returned to the riverbank, feeling strangely safer near the water, and spent her 11th night in the jungle, shivering and waiting. The next morning, January 3rd, 1972, she heard voices. Human voices. She staggered back toward the hut. 3 men emerged from the forest. They were local lumberjacks, but when they saw her, they stopped dead in their tracks, terrified. Julian was a horrifying sight. She was skeletal, her skin was pale white, covered in blood and bites, her eyes were blood red, her blonde hair matted with mud. The men didn't see a 17-year-old girl. They saw a ghost. They thought she was a Yakumama, a mythical pale-skinned water spirit known to lure men to their deaths. They were paralyzed with fear. Fortunately, Julian spoke fluent Spanish. She called out to them, "My name is Julian. I was on the Lanza plane that crashed. Help me." The sound of her voice broke the spell. They realized she was real, and they rushed to help her. They cleaned her wounds properly and gave her some basic food, the first real meal she had eaten in 11 days. They were astonished by her story. They had heard about the crash but assumed everyone was dead. Search operations had been officially called off days ago. It was too late to travel, so they let her rest. The next morning, they placed her gently in the canoe and began the long journey downriver. It was a 7-hour trip to the nearest settlement. For the first time since the plane exploded, Julian felt safe. They arrived in a small village where she was taken to a local missionary hospital. Doctors were stunned by her condition, but even more stunned that she was alive. They removed dozens more maggots from various wounds on her body. From the hospital, she was airlifted to Pucallpa, the destination she had been trying to reach for nearly 2 weeks. There, she was reunited with her father, Hans Wilhelm. He had been waiting in agonizing limbo, fearing the worst. When he saw Julian, he could barely speak. It was an emotional reunion, to say the least, a mixture of overwhelming relief and shared grief for Maria. Once Julian was stable enough, she assisted the search parties. She provided the crucial information needed to locate the crash site, guiding them along the path she had taken. How she survived the 2-mile fall is a statistical miracle. Experts believe the row of 3 seats she was strapped to acted like a helicopter rotor, spinning and significantly slowing her descent. The intense updraft of the thunderstorm may also have acted as a bit of a buffer for her fall. Finally, the dense vines and foliage of the Amazon canopy cushioned the impact. Over the next few days, authorities recovered the bodies of the 91 victims. It was during this process that the full tragedy of the crash was revealed. Autopsies showed that Julian was not the only person to survive the initial impact. As many as 14 other passengers had lived through the fall, but they were too injured, too scared, or simply lacked the survival knowledge to move. They died in the jungle, waiting for a rescue that never came. On January 12th, they found the body of Maria Köpke. The investigation confirmed a heartbreaking truth. Juliana's mother had also survived the fall, but her injuries were severe. She lived for several days on the jungle floor, conscious but immobilized, before finally succumbing to her wounds. The thought that her mother died alone, perhaps nearby, would haunt Julian forever. Julian was the sole survivor of Lanza Flight 508, not because she was the luckiest, but because she was the only one who knew what to do. Faced with impossible odds, she never panicked. The survival lessons that defined her childhood became her parents' final gift, bringing her back from the dead. In that green hell, the legacy of her mother and father was the only thing stronger than death. You won't believe what the people in these next two stories did to survive. Click now to see what they did to stay alive, and ask yourself, could you do the same? Subscribe for more, and I'll see you soon.